I've got some troubling news about England's royal family.
Before sunrise, 3 of King Charles III's most powerful and loyal advisors simultaneously surrendered their security passes, cleared their desks, and left Buckingham Palace in silence. No announcement, no farewell, no explanation. By 4:40 a.m., 3 sealed envelopes lay neatly in the mailroom, all addressed directly to the king. As Charles read the final lines, he showed no anger. He simply removed his glasses, placed them on the desk, and remained eerily silent. For these 3 were no ordinary employees. They were men who had spent decades protecting the monarchy, keeping national secrets and preventing personal influence from exceeding constitutional limits. But this time, they were delivering a shocking warning. They swore to serve the monarchy, not an unqualified successor. And the person they were referring to was Queen Camilla. So what really happened behind the closed doors of the palace? How far had Camilla gone? And why did Charles so gently pull the file from her hands the moment she entered the room? Before the story begins, tell us, where are you following this story from? Leave your city or country in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe, because what's uncovered inside those 3 letters could push the royal family closer to a power crisis than ever before. It had been brewing for weeks, quietly, slowly, almost unnoticed. As King Charles III's health began to decline, the first changes in the palace were explained by 2 very logical words: protecting the king. Charles was often exhausted after long audiences. Some nights he would still sit before red boxes filled with official documents, even though his concentration had noticeably diminished. Those close to him said he sometimes had to reread the same page multiple times, pause in the middle of a summary, or ask an assistant to re-explain what had just been presented. In this context, Camilla began to support her husband. Initially, her role seemed perfectly logical. She helped determine which meetings could be postponed, which documents needed to be placed on Charles's desk first, which issues could wait until the next morning, and which information shouldn't add to his stress during his treatment. No one objected. Many in the palace even felt relieved that Charles had a close confidant by his side, someone who understood his health and limitations. But then this temporary support began to change. Camilla's private secretary appeared at meetings previously reserved only for the king's constitutional team. Requests to see Charles were no longer delivered directly to his office. They had to go through Camilla's department first. Some documents were withheld on the grounds that the king needed rest. Some audiences were cut short without official explanation. Some documents returned with additions after Charles had left his desk. None of these changes, taken individually, were significant enough to cause a crisis. But when all were put together, they revealed a different system slowly emerging within the palace. Margaret Ellison was the first to see the clear signs. One evening, she discovered Camilla's private secretary had brought her a government report with handwritten revisions, even though Charles hadn't even read the original. Margaret asked who had authorized the changes. The answer sent a chill down her spine. The secretary said Camilla was only protecting the king from unnecessary pressure. But to Margaret, it was no longer protection. If a document had been altered before reaching the monarch, Charles no longer had a choice between options. He only saw the option someone else had already chosen for him. Daniel Mercer also began to notice irregularities. Letters from ministers sometimes disappeared for hours. Documents returned with different content. Orders were issued in the king's name, but Daniel couldn't find any record confirming Charles had directly approved them. Meanwhile, Sir Alistair Pembroke quietly recorded every change. He kept track of the time, the name of the person delivering the document, the version before and after the revisions, and even the meetings where Camilla's office appeared, despite lacking clear constitutional authority. Then a special draft was placed on their table. It was a provisional plan in case Charles's health prevented him from fully performing his duties. In the first version, Prince William was designated to play a supporting role as heir. But in the revised version, William's name disappeared. In its place was a section granting Camilla the authority to coordinate. No new signatures, no minutes of approval, no evidence that Charles fully understood the changes. And at that very moment, the three advisors began to ask the question that no one in the palace wanted to voice. Was Camilla still helping the king exercise his power, or had she begun to wield that power on his behalf? That question remained unanswered until 11 nights before the three advisors simultaneously departed Buckingham Palace. That evening, a closed-door meeting was convened at Windsor. The official purpose was simple: to adjust King Charles III's schedule during his recovery. Just hours earlier, Charles had suffered a severe bout of exhaustion during a private audience. He lost focus during the conversation, had to stop several times, and was eventually taken back to his room earlier than expected. The king's physician gave clear advice. Charles needed at least 14 days of rest. He had to significantly reduce his official duties. And most importantly, he should not make complex decisions while his body was so fatigued. In the meeting room were Prince William, Sir Alistair Pembroke, Margaret Ellison, Daniel Mercer, the king's physician, and a government representative. All understood that this meeting needed to be conducted cautiously. But the moment Camilla entered, the atmosphere instantly changed. She carried a thick file already filled with detailed notes and annotations. Before the formal discussion began, Camilla asked her two assistants to leave the room. Then she opened the file and began presenting the changes as if they had been decided beforehand. No one was asked for their opinion. There was no vote. There was no private confirmation from Charles. Camilla proceeded to list the meetings that would be canceled, the audiences that would be shortened, and the documents that would no longer be delivered directly to the king. Charles tried to intervene. He opened to the first page and began explaining which appointments needed to be postponed. But mid-sentence he stopped. His gaze drifted from the page as if he had forgotten what he was about to say. William immediately reached for the file to help his father. But before his hand could touch the document, Camilla closed it. The dry sound of the file cover echoed in the silent room. She said Charles had approved the revised schedule, and that further questioning would only exhaust him. William didn't look at Camilla. He looked straight at his father. Then he asked a very simple question. Did Charles really read all those changes? The king didn't answer immediately. He looked down at the table. Then he turned to Camilla before attempting to speak. That very moment made William realize the matter was far more serious than his father's health. Charles seemed no longer certain which decisions were his own and which had been laid out before him in his weakened state. But the silence quickly turned into confrontation. Camilla turned to Daniel Mercer and asked him to postpone a previously scheduled ministerial audience. Instead, she wanted a private consultation led by her own office. Daniel didn't need time to think. He calmly refused. He said a queen consort could support the monarch, protect his health, and stand by him during the most difficult times. But a queen consort could not divert state affairs without the king's explicit approval. The room fell silent. Camilla looked at Daniel and said that he had to decide for himself whether his loyalty lay in rigid procedures or in Charles's survival. Sir Alistair immediately opened his notebook and wrote down every word. Margaret also recorded that statement in her file, for all three understood that Camilla had just equated obeying her wishes with protecting the king. Before the meeting ended, Charles suddenly felt unwell. A doctor and an assistant quickly escorted him out of the room. William followed his father a few steps before stopping. Behind him, Camilla remained standing by the meeting table. She placed her hand on the official schedule and declared that all the changes presented would remain in effect. Charles was not in the room. There was no new confirmation, no signatures in front of witnesses, only Camilla's words. And that was the moment Sir Alistair, Margaret, and Daniel understood that they could no longer fix things with discreet warnings. The line had been crossed. Silence was no longer loyalty. It had become complicity. And so that very night in Windsor, the three advisors understood they were left with only two options. Either remain accepting their role within a system where the king's power was increasingly filtered through others, or create a shock large enough that no one in the palace could remain indifferent. For the next 11 days, Sir Alistair Pembroke, Margaret Ellison, and Daniel Mercer did not openly confront Camilla. They did something far more dangerous. They began gathering evidence. Each man was responsible for a different part of the picture. Sir Alistair reviewed constitutional directives, comparing each version of the text and noting when changes appeared. Margaret examined the flow of documents between Charles's office, senior members of the royal family, and government agencies. Daniel traced ministerial letters that had been delayed, diverted, or returned with different content than the original. It was all placed in a locked red box. Inside were not just suspicions. There were the original and revised versions of the same document. There were official schedules altered after Charles had retired. There were handwritten notes passed through Camilla's office. There were medical and constitutional summaries shortened before reaching those who needed to know them. And there was a list of decisions issued in the king's name, but without clear confirmation that Charles had actually read and approved them. As the documents were sorted chronologically, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. It was no longer a few isolated incidents, no longer a delayed meeting or a redacted report. A chart in the red box documented 11 major decisions that had passed through Camilla's office before being implemented. These documents concerned audiences with ministers, royal appointments, overseas representation matters, the restructuring of certain departments within the royal household, plans prepared in case Charles was temporarily incapacitated, and most worryingly, Prince William's access to information. Among these papers was a handwritten note instructing staff to provide William with only excerpts deemed essential from medical and constitutional summaries. The wording sounded cautious, but its true meaning was clear. William, the heir to the throne, had been restricted from accessing information about his father's health. He was not allowed to see the full course of action should Charles be unable to continue working fully. He also lacked full access to documents that could determine how power was maintained during the king's decline. A handwriting analysis of the records linked that note to personal instructions that had originated from Camilla. But the more serious discovery lay in two other signatures. Two high-ranking officials had signed an internal routing agreement, accepting a mechanism for filtering information before documents reached Charles or William. This meant Camilla was not acting alone. A structure had formed around her, comprised of people who believed they were protecting the king by deciding for him what should be known, who should be seen, and which voices should be silenced. Daniel looked at the documents and began to waver. He said resigning while Charles was ill could be seen as abandoning the king at a time when he needed his most loyal followers. Sir Alistair remained silent for a long time before replying. He said that leaving might be like abandoning Charles, but staying would mean continuing to allow others to use Charles's voice without his confirmation. Margaret understood that any further discreet warnings would be delayed, downplayed, or presented as internal dissent, so they decided to act simultaneously. 3 letters, 3 security passes returned, 3 desks left empty before dawn. But those letters weren't written simply to leave the palace. They were designed as a key that would force Charles to open the red box, force William to see how isolated he had been, and force the entire Buckingham Palace to confront a truth that could no longer be concealed. A parallel power structure had been built right next to the throne. The red box had finally completed its task. The 3 resignation letters not only shook Buckingham Palace, but forced King Charles III to make a decision he never thought he would face. That very midday, a message arrived for Sir Alistair Pembroke, Margaret Ellison, and Daniel Mercer. The king wanted to see them again, not in a formal meeting. No press, no secretaries, no minutes taker, only those directly involved in the crisis. As the door to the private reception room closed, the atmosphere was so heavy that almost no one spoke. Charles sat in the chairman's seat, but weariness was evident on his face. Before the king lay the opened red box, along with the documents he had been reviewing for hours. Camilla stood beside Charles's chair, as she had done in recent weeks. Opposite them sat Prince William. He wasn't seated next to his father. He chose a seat opposite Camilla. That distance wasn't just a matter of seating arrangement. It was a declaration that from this moment on, the heir to the throne would directly face any unanswered questions. Sir Alistair, Margaret, and Daniel entered one after another. None carried briefcases. None attempted to explain their resignations. Camilla was the first to break the silence. She looked directly at the three advisors and said that they had abandoned a sick king at a time when he needed his most loyal followers. She argued that their simultaneous departure had damaged Charles's reputation more than any administrative error. According to Camilla, they had prioritized rigid procedures over the stability of the monarchy. Margaret listened intently without interrupting. When Camilla finished, she responded calmly. She said the three of them had stayed until continuing to stay was no longer an act of loyalty. It had become a betrayal of their oath to protect the throne. Sir Alistair slowly removed his last security badge from his pocket. He placed it down on the wooden table. The small sound silenced the entire room. He looked directly at Camilla and spoke in a firm voice. A queen has no right to change the orders of the state. No one responded immediately. Instead, Sir Alistair opened the file before Charles. He took out two memos that were almost identical in form. At first glance, they differed by only a few lines of text. But it was those lines of text that changed the entire meaning of the document. The first was the one Charles had reviewed that afternoon before his rest. The second version was subsequently revised at the request of Camilla's office. Sir Alistair pointed out each added paragraph, each changed sentence, and each note that appeared after the king had left his desk. Daniel Mercer continued. He stated that this revision was not only kept in the archives, it was also sent with a confirmation that this was King Charles III's finalized view. But Daniel clarified that he could not find any record proving Charles had reviewed the revision, nor any document confirming the king had directly approved the final changes. William silently picked up both memos. He placed them side by side. In just a few minutes, all remaining doubts vanished. For days, William had hoped it was all a misunderstanding due to his father's health. But now the evidence was right before his eyes. It was no longer the account of three advisors. These were two official documents bearing the same title, but containing two completely different contents. Charles gazed intently at the pages. Finally, he turned to Camilla. He didn't raise his voice. He asked only one question. Would you allow these changes to be made? Camilla bowed slightly. She didn't deny it. She said she was only doing what was necessary to prevent the government from seeing Charles's weakness. If decisions were delayed or the king continued to appear exhausted before his ministers' confidence in the monarchy could be damaged. In her mind, that was how she was protecting her husband. Charles remained silent. He didn't argue. He didn't reproach. He didn't refute. After a few seconds, the king slowly asked everyone to leave the room, except for Prince William. As the door closed behind the last of them, only the father and son remained. And for the first time since it all began, Charles was forced to confront a possibility he had never dared to consider. The king's power might have been wielded in his name, without his full consent. The moment the door closed, the room fell into a suffocating silence. No more Camilla, no more three advisors. No one left for Charles to lean on as a buffer between him and the truth. Only a weakening father and a son who knew he could no longer pretend everything was under control. Charles looked down at the two memos still lying before him. He spoke slowly, as if each word weighed heavier than he had prepared to admit. Initially, he had only allowed Camilla's office access to his daily schedule during his treatment. That was considered a temporary solution. Camilla would help him determine which meetings needed prioritizing, which documents could wait, and which issues shouldn't be brought before him when his body was so exhausted. Charles believed he still held the final say, but he didn't realize how far that access had expanded. He confessed that there were nights when he no longer had the strength to read through every document. There were times when he would just listen to the summary and sign it believing that the most important information had already been explained. He believed Camilla was helping him keep the business running, but the deeper reason lay in a fear Charles kept hidden. He feared the government would know the full extent of his decline. He feared the public would see a king unable to fulfill his schedule. And most of all, he feared that publicly asking for help would be interpreted as an admission that he was no longer capable of holding the crown. William listened without interrupting. The anger was still there, but seeing his father sitting before him, weary and almost ashamed of his own weakness, his voice softened. William said that illness did not make Charles any less worthy. No one can choose when their body is failing, and asking for assistance doesn't mean giving up the throne. But there's a line that can't be blurred. Someone can help the king read documents. Someone can protect his rest time. Someone can stand by his side when he's in pain. But no one is allowed to speak in the king's voice unless he himself has made the decision. William stated bluntly that letting that line disappear would put the entire monarchy in jeopardy. And it also put Charles's marriage in a position where trust would be very difficult to restore. Then William pulled the red box closer. He opened the lid and placed each document on the table one by one. The first chart recorded 11 decisions that had been passed through Camilla's office. Next were directives bearing Charles's name, but without direct confirmation. Then came the abridged summaries. Finally, William pulled out a note requesting that information be limited. Charles read each line. He stopped when he saw the content relating to medical meetings and the Constitution. William asked if he had ever authorized his son to be excluded from that information. Charles answered immediately, no, he had never authorized that. William placed the handwritten note in front of his father. Charles recognized the handwriting after only a few seconds. He read it again, then a second time. Then he closed his eyes. In that moment, he understood that the authority he had once granted for support had been used to erect a barrier around himself. William wasn't just being kept outside. Charles was also being kept inside a system where he could no longer see the full extent of what was being done in his name. The king opened his eyes, pulled an official decree toward him, and requested a pen. His first strokes were slow, but the more he wrote, the steadier his hand became. The new document immediately restored full authority over state affairs to the monarch's official secretariat. It granted William full access to all medical and constitutional summaries whenever Charles was no longer able to handle the entire workload. It forbade Camilla's office from communicating any state directives without Charles's direct, explicitly recorded approval. All documents altered during his treatment had to be reviewed. And finally, the 3 advisors who had resigned were to be invited back, not to erase what had happened, but to witness the restoration of legitimate power. Charles signed at the bottom of the page. In a room devoid of cameras and witnesses, he quietly reclaimed his voice. But he and William had no idea that just hours later, a photograph of 3 empty tables would appear on the front page. And the secret the palace had been trying to repair from within would explode into a national crisis. At 6 a.m. the following morning, a major newspaper published a photograph of 3 empty desks inside the royal office. No people, no files, no security passes, only 3 empty spaces under the cold lights of a room that had once been the center of the most sensitive decisions. The headline above the photograph immediately caused a sensation. 3 advisors had served the king, not the shadow that surrounded him. Within minutes, television stations changed their entire morning broadcast schedules. Regular programming was interrupted. Constitutional experts were invited on air to explain something the public had rarely had to worry about before. A queen consort could support the monarch. She could stand beside him in ceremonies. She could protect his health and privacy. But that person was not permitted to independently adjust state affairs, alter official directives, or control access to the monarch without clearly established authority. And that was the question that began to worry the whole of England. Had Camilla merely supported Charles during his decline, or had an unofficial power structure truly been operating alongside the throne? Buckingham Palace responded with a brief statement. The 3 resignation letters were described as an internal personnel matter, but that explanation almost immediately crumbled. A national broadcaster obtained a portion of the 3 advisors' joint letter and read it live on air. The public heard the declaration that they swore to serve the monarchy, not an unqualified successor. That statement spread like wildfire. Outside Buckingham Palace, crowds began to gather. Some people held signs demanding that the royal family speak only in an official voice. Others wanted to know who had approved the altered documents. And above all, the public demanded answers about Charles's true condition. In another room, William watched the news with Catherine. Each time a commentator suggested the palace was deliberately concealing the extent of the king's illness, William's face tensed. He wanted to refute it. He wanted to defend his father. He wanted to make it clear that Charles had not voluntarily relinquished his power. But Catherine stopped him from reacting too quickly. She reminded William that at this moment, he could not act merely as an angry son whose father had been hurt. He had to act as a future king, a man responsible for keeping the institution from collapsing under the pressure of family emotions. Catherine's words silenced William. He understood that any uncontrolled statement could turn the constitutional crisis into an open war between members of the royal family. Elsewhere in the palace, Camilla sat alone in front of a screen. The presenter described her actions as protection that had crossed the line and become illegal control. Camilla didn't react, but when the news switched to images of the crowd outside the palace gates, she turned off the television. Shortly afterward, a security officer arrived at her office. By William's order, access to the king's scheduled official briefings and the state mail system was revoked. Camilla asked if she was being treated as a threat in her own home. No one answered. That silence was more painful than any accusation. Before noon, Charles finally allowed an official statement to be released. The statement confirmed that all state power remained with the monarch. William would publicly assist when Charles's health prevented him from handling all affairs, and Camilla's role from that point onward would be limited to personal and ceremonial support. The statement somewhat calmed the storm outside. The public received what they needed most, a clear boundary. But inside Buckingham Palace, the matter was far from over. Charles had restored his power. William had been brought back to the center of all decisions. Camilla had been removed from the state apparatus. But the king still had to deliver the final verdict, not only for his wife who had overstepped her boundaries, but also for the 3 advisors who had forced the monarchy to confront the truth. The final meeting took place in silence. No photographers waited outside the door. No press releases were prepared. No one entered the room with the air of a victor. King Charles III sat in the chairman's seat. Prince William sat to his right. Queen Camilla sat a few seats away from Charles, a small distance, but enough to show that things had changed. Opposite them were Sir Alistair Pembroke, Margaret Ellison, and Daniel Mercer, 3 men who had left their positions to force the entire palace to confront a truth no one wanted to acknowledge. Charles spoke first. He did not blame them. He thanked them. The king acknowledged that the simultaneous resignation of the 3 advisors was not betrayal. It was the final act of service by those who understood that loyalty to the throne sometimes required opposing those closest to the throne. Charles offered all 3 their former positions. Margaret only agreed after receiving a clear assurance no official would ever have to choose between obeying a member of the royal family and protecting the integrity of the institution. Daniel bowed in acceptance. Sir Alistair said little. He simply nodded. Then Camilla broke the silence. She admitted she had crossed the line between supporting her husband and running through him. Fear had led her to believe that control meant protection. But Charles responded with a concise statement. Love can explain fear. It cannot justify decisions made in the name of others. The verdict was then announced in that very room. Camilla's office was barred from all state correspondence. The 2 courtiers who had delivered unauthorized instructions were dismissed. Every decision changed during Charles's illness had to be reviewed. and no private household was allowed to control access to state affairs anymore. Camilla remained with Charles as wife and queen in ceremonial activities, but she no longer had the right to touch the state apparatus. William was given new responsibilities. Whenever Charles was unable to handle all the work, William would coordinate constitutional duties through a transparent, limited, documented, and verifiable mechanism. No more orders in the shadows. No more power passed through private doors. The three advisors returned. Charles retained the crown. William accepted the burden that awaited him. Camilla remained by her husband's side, but the trust between them had been wounded beyond repair. And that is the greatest value of this story. Power isn't just about who wields it. Power also needs strong boundaries to prevent others from using it on your behalf. True loyalty isn't always about staying put, remaining silent, and obeying. Sometimes the highest form of loyalty is daring to step out of the room, daring to relinquish your position, and forcing an entire institution to look at what's being concealed. Did the three advisors do the right thing, or did they put a sick king in greater danger? In your opinion, was their action the highest expression of loyalty or an overly risky act of resistance at the most sensitive moment? Leave your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories.